Have you ever wondered how a cutting-edge biotech company actually manages to pull off what is, frankly, the ultimate corporate juggling act?
Oh, it really is a juggling act. I mean, the sheer scale of the contradictions is just wild.
Right. Think about it. On one side of the building, you have these brilliant scientists in lab coats, and they're, trying to literally decode the human genome.
Untangling incredibly complex neural pathways, discovering life-altering treatments, yeah.
Exactly. And they are operating on a timeline of decades. But then on the exact opposite side of the building, you've got the financial executives.
Right, the ones staring down Wall Street.
Yeah, staring down those notoriously brutal quarter-by-quarter, sometimes minute-by-minute earnings expectations. It sounds completely impossible.
It's an incredibly delicate, high-wire act. You've got the boundless idealism of pure biological science just crashing headfirst into the cold, hard pragmatism of corporate finance.
And usually when you listen in on how these companies report their progress to the financial world, to the institutional investors, the hedge funds, the analysts, it sounds like pure mathematics.
Oh, absolutely. It's very binary. You hear about spreadsheets, profit margins, capital allocation, basis points.
But if you know how to read between the lines, if you actually understand the science beneath the ticker symbols, those numbers are telling a deeply human story about the future of medicine.
They really are. I mean, every dollar of revenue is essentially a proxy for a patient whose life has changed. And every dollar of R&D is a promise to a patient who is still waiting for a cure.
And that is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. So it is Wednesday, May 13th, 2026. And we are looking at a fresh, highly detailed stack of sources.
We've got the Q1 2026 earnings call transcript, their latest corporate profile, and a ton of clinical presentation data from Neurocrine Biosciences.
Yes, Neurocrine. For those of you tracking the market, their ticker is NBIX. They are headquartered in San Diego, and they're currently doing some genuinely wild frontier-level work across neurology, endocrinology, and psychiatry.
Truly groundbreaking stuff.
Our goal today is to take what is essentially a dense, jargon-heavy financial update and translate it into a fascinating narrative for you. We're going to decode how innovative science actually translates into commercial success, and more importantly, how that success dictates the timeline of patient impact.
I love that. And I want to emphasize right at the top that we aren't just going to be reciting a spreadsheet to you today. We are going to explore the underlying biological logic and the market mechanics of, why these numbers actually matter.
Because they really do. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the numbers Neurocrine just reported for their first quarter are staggering. But the biology driving those numbers is even more fascinating.
A biotech company's current financial health is the literal physical fuel for the medicines that will be available to you, your family, or your friends a decade from now.
Right. If the revenue engine sputters today, the groundbreaking cures of tomorrow will just, never leave the laboratory.
They'll just become abandoned patents gathering dust.
That is such a crucial framing. So we have to start with the foundation, which is that revenue engine. Because in the first quarter of 2026, Neurocrine didn't just meet Wall Street's expectations. They completely shattered them.
It was a blowout quarter.
It really was. For the very first time in the company's entire history, their quarterly net product sales crossed the $800 million mark. That is a massive 44% year-over-year growth.
Which is a huge acceleration for a company of this size.
And their net income hit roughly $200 million. Now, they reported that on both a GAAP and non-GAAP basis, which usually means two very different things to accountants.
It does, yeah. And it's a testament to incredibly clean operational execution that both of those metrics look so strong.
Can you briefly demystify that for anyone listening who doesn't spend their days modeling financial statements?
Sure. So GAAP stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. It's the strict, standardized, highly regulated way companies are legally required to report their earnings.
The official rule book.
Exactly. Non-GAAP, on the other hand, is a supplementary metric where the company essentially says, hey, if we strip out certain one-time, unusual, or non-cash expenses, here is a clearer look at our core day-to-day operating performance.
Right, because otherwise, a one-time real estate sale or a sudden legal settlement could make a company look artificially profitable or artificially bankrupt for a single quarter, right?
Precisely. In Neurocrine's case this quarter, their GAAP numbers actually included some massive financial gains from their equity investments and the strategic sale of a European business unit called Diurnal.
Got it. So the non-GAAP smooths that out.
Right. Their non-GAAP numbers factored out those gains, but they also factored out about $44 million in milestone expenses and in-process R&D costs, which is essentially money they spent to acquire new science.
But I guess the ultimate takeaway from the analyst perspective is that regardless of which accounting lens you use, generating roughly $200 million in pure profit on $800 million in sales demonstrates a highly tuned, highly profitable commercial machine.
It's an incredibly robust bottom line.
And the absolute powerhouse of that machine, like the lion's share of that revenue, is driven by their flagship drug, Ingresa. This drug alone brought in $657 million in the first quarter.
That's up 20% from the exact same time last year.
Which is huge. Now, Ingresa is primarily used to treat tardive dyskinesia, commonly called TD in the chorea, or involuntary writhing associated with Huntington's disease. I want to pause here and really dig into the mechanism.
We definitely should, because you can't understand the value of this drug without understanding the sheer mechanical nightmare of tardive dyskinesia.
It is a devastating condition. Tardive dyskinesia is a movement disorder characterized by uncontrollable, involuntary, and repetitive movements.
Right. We are talking about severe facial grimacing, constant lip smacking, tongue protrusion, and sometimes really violent, jerky movements of the arms, legs, and torso.
It's physically exhausting, it's socially isolating, and what makes it particularly tragic is its origin.
The origin is what gets me too. It is generally a side effect of the exact medications designed to help people.
Yeah, it's primarily caused by long-term use of certain psychiatric medications, right? Particularly typical antipsychotics used to treat schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe depression.
Exactly. To understand the mechanism here, we have to look at how those antipsychotics actually work.
Okay, let's get into the cellular level.
So many antipsychotics function by blocking dopamine receptors in the brain, specifically the D2 receptors.
And dopamine is the neurotransmitter heavily involved in motor control, reward, and motivation.
Right. If someone has schizophrenia, they often have an overactivity of those dopamine pathways, which contributes to hallucinations and delusions. So the drugs block the receptors to calm that overactivity.
But the brain is highly adaptive, right? I mean, if you block the receptors for years, the brain senses that it's being starved of dopamine signals.
It does. The brain tries to compensate by becoming hypersensitive. It essentially upregulates the receptors, making them exquisitely sensitive to any tiny drop of dopamine that does manage to get through.
Oh, wow. So eventually, when dopamine interacts with these hypersensitized receptors in the motor control areas of the brain, it triggers an explosive, exaggerated response.
That explosion of signals is exactly what causes the involuntary, jerky movements of tardive dyskinesia.
So the very mechanism designed to stabilize their mind ends up literally destroying their physical control.
It's a brutal trade-off.
And this is where Ingresa comes in. It is a VMAT2 inhibitor. Now, I was looking at the biology here, and VMAT2 stands for vesicular monoamine transporter 2.
That's a mouthful.
It is. But from what I gather, VMAT2 is basically the packaging department in a brain cell. Its job is to scoop up dopamine and package it into little cellular shipping containers called vesicles so it can be released into the synapse.
Yes, perfectly stated.
So if Ingresa inhibits VMAT2, it's essentially slowing down that packaging process, right?
That is a brilliant analogy. By partially blocking that packaging protein, Ingresa ensures that less dopamine actually makes it into those vesicles.
Got it.
Consequently, when the neuron files, less dopamine is released into the synapse. You are essentially lowering the overall volume of the dopamine signal.
And because you've lowered the volume, those hypersensitive receptors aren't triggered nearly as violently.
Exactly. You are calming the electrical storm in the motor pathways, which dramatically reduces or even completely stops the involuntary movements.
And crucially, it does this without the patient having to stop taking their life-saving antipsychotic medication.
Which is completely life-changing.
And clearly the financial results reflect that impact. But, the sheer volume of that $657 million figure in the first quarter actually surprised analysts due to something called payer seasonality.
Ah, yes. Payer seasonality.
Yeah, on the earnings call, the CFO, Matt Abernathy, sounded almost relieved when he discussed Q1. I always hear Q1 referred to as the heart attack quarter for the pharmaceutical industry. What exactly is payer seasonality, and why does it terrify pharma executives every single year?
It all comes down to the labyrinthian architecture of how health insurance works in the United States. When the clock strikes midnight on New Year's Eve, the entire system, essentially resets.
The slate is wiped clean.
And that creates massive systemic bottlenecks.
Like having to start the bureaucratic marathon all over again.
Precisely. Let's look at the two main buckets of patients. For Medicare Part D patients, you have massive waves of prescription reauthorizations that need to be processed by doctors and approved by the government.
Because the prior authorizations from the previous year just expire.
Right. So patients go to the pharmacy in January and suddenly their drug is denied until the doctor fills out new paperwork. That delays the refill.
And what about for patients on commercial employer-sponsored insurance?
Well, for them, it's a massive financial shock. On January 1st, their out-of-pocket deductibles and copays reset back to zero.
Oh, man. So imagine a patient taking Ingresa. By December of the previous year, they had already hit their annual deductible, so their insurance was covering 100% of the cost.
They were paying nothing at the pharmacy counter.
Then January rolls around, they go to pick up their prescription, and the pharmacist says, okay, that will be $2,000 to meet your new deductible.
That is a devastating surprise. And a lot of patients probably just walk away from the counter without the drug.
It's a huge hurdle. This dynamic, the paperwork delays for Medicare and the deductible shock for commercial insurance, it causes a massive industry-wide drop-off in prescription, fills across almost every therapeutic area in the first quarter.
Companies routinely see their revenue take a massive hit from Q4 to Q1.
But Neurocrine somehow completely dodged this systemic issue.
They navigated it flawlessly. The CFO noted that their internal patient support programs, their pharmacy networks, and their commercial teams managed through this gross-to-net seasonality incredibly well.
So the $657 million wasn't just a fluke.
No, it reflected very strong underlying demand. And they actually saw record new patient additions during a quarter where most companies struggled just to keep their existing patients on therapy.
That's incredibly bullish for the stock. They were so confident in this underlying momentum that they reaffirmed their massive financial guidance, predicting Ingresa will bring in between $2.7 and $2.8 billion for the full year of 2026.
It's a massive number.
Okay, but this is the specific metric that completely blows my mind when you look at the life cycle of pharmaceutical products. Ingresa was approved in 2017. It is currently in its 9th year since launch. 9 years.
It's basically a dinosaur in biotech years.
Right, and it is still experiencing massive double-digit volume growth. In the fast-moving, hyper-competitive world of biotech, that just defies gravity.
It really does.
That is like a tech gadget from 2017, like, I don't know, an iPhone 8, somehow still being the absolute hottest, fastest-growing holiday gift on the market today. Usually after 3 or 4 years, growth plateaus, generic competitors swoop in, or the market just naturally saturates.
Yeah, that's the typical curve.
So how is a 9-year-old drug still finding a record number of new patients?
What's fascinating here is the absolute staggering scale of the unmet medical need that still exists, even a decade into the drug's lifespan.
I mean, you would logically think that after 9 years of heavy marketing and doctor education, everyone who desperately needs this drug would be on it.
You would think so. But on the earnings call, the chief commercial officer, Eric Benovich, pointed out something extraordinary about the epidemiology of tardive dyskinesia.
Let's hear the numbers, because this is where the gap between diagnosis and treatment gets genuinely shocking.
So Benovich noted that their educational campaigns have actually been wildly successful on the diagnostic front. Approximately 90% of patients presenting with these symptoms are now successfully diagnosed with tardive dyskinesia by their doctors.
That is a phenomenal diagnostic rate for a specialist condition.
But here is the tragic paradox. They estimate there are roughly 800,000 TD patients in the United States right now.
Okay, 800,000.
And out of those 800,000, only a little over 5,000 of them are currently receiving the standard of care, meaning a first-line treatment with a VMAT2 inhibitor like Ingresa.
Wait, I just want to make sure I'm fully comprehending that scale. Out of 800,000 people suffering from uncontrollable, isolating facial and body movements, only about 5,000 are getting the primary targeted treatment.
That's wrong.
Even when 90% of them have been formally diagnosed. Why in the world is there such a massive canyon between a doctor writing the diagnosis in the chart and actually prescribing the life-altering medication?
It is a complex mix of clinical inertia and psychiatric prioritization.
Meaning what exactly?
Historically, psychiatrists are dealing with patients who have severe, sometimes life-threatening mental illnesses like schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. The primary focus is just keeping the patient mentally stable.
So if the antipsychotic is working, there is a massive reluctance to alter the patient's chemical regimen.
Exactly. Many doctors traditionally feared that adding a new, powerful neurological drug like a VMAT2 inhibitor might somehow destabilize the patient's psychiatric state.
Even though the clinical data proves Ingresa is safe to use concurrently.
Yes. The fear just outweighs the data for a lot of older practitioners. Furthermore, because TD was historically considered an untreatable side effect, many simply accepted it as the unavoidable cost of mental stability.
They would tell patients, I know the movements are distressing, but at least your hallucinations are gone.
That was the exact mindset.
So it is a deeply entrenched behavioral habit in the medical community. They are so focused on the psychiatric fire that they ignore the neurological smoke.
Precisely. And breaking that clinical inertia takes years of relentless data presentation and peer-to-peer education. That is why the ceiling for this drug is still incredibly high. Neurocrine is slowly but surely changing the standard of care.
Plus, the overall use of antipsychotic medications in the United States is growing rapidly, right? Not just for schizophrenia, but as adjunctive therapies for major depression and anxiety.
Very true. So the underlying prevalence of tardive dyskinesia is actually expected to rise over time at a rate that far exceeds general U.S. population growth.
And Neurocrine recognized this expanding market, which is why they recently made a massive investment to expand their field sales force, specifically to call on a much larger untapped base of psychiatric healthcare providers.
So the patient pool itself is expanding, and they are finally penetrating the psychological barriers of the prescribers.
That completely explains the almost unheard of 9-year growth trajectory. And the sheer volume of cash that Ingresa generates is what funds the entire rest of the company. On the call, Matt Abernathy outlined a very clear 3-part framework for their capital allocation priorities.
And this is crucial for retail investors to understand.
Number 1, aggressively drive revenue growth for their current commercial products. Number 2, advance the R&D pipeline. And number 3, invest in external business development and acquisitions.
That framework is the absolute Rosetta Stone for understanding this company. It explains every single strategic decision they make.
It's a textbook strategy for sustainable long-term biotech growth. You take the massive, incredibly durable cash flows from your foundational, highly sticky products, and you pour them directly back into high-risk research and strategic acquisitions.
You're essentially using today's cash cow to buy tomorrow's unicorns.
And that leads us perfectly into looking at the results of that exact strategy. Because while Ingresa is the cash cow, we have to talk about the newly crowned unicorn, Chronicity.
Yes, Chronicity.
On the earnings call, I noticed the executive sometimes pronounced it chronicity or kinicity, but however you phonetically sound it out, this new drug is making serious, immediate waves in the endocrine world.
It really is. It is specifically designed for a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH.
And the launch numbers are absurd. In Q1, it pulled in $158 million. It is already annualizing at over $600 million, basically right out of the gate.
Which firmly and instantly puts it on the trajectory to become a massive blockbuster drug.
But we already know Chronicity is generating phenomenal revenue. I want to look at the human element here. How are the patients actually using it, and why are specialized endocrinologists adopting it at a speed that is, frankly, startling for a new therapy?
I dug deep into the real-world usage statistics they provided, and they are incredible. Over 1,200 unique healthcare providers have already prescribed it to their patients.
But the most vital metric is persistency, meaning once a patient starts taking the medication, how long do they actually stay on it?
Right, because in the highly controlled environment of their clinical trials, they saw over a 95% completion rate.
But trial data is often rosy because patients are being monitored constantly. The true test is the real world.
Exactly. And in their 2-year open-label extension studies in the wild, they are seeing over 80% of patients sticking with the daily regimen.
In chronic disease management, an 80% long-term retention rate is remarkably rare.
It is incredibly rare, and it speaks directly to 2 things: the extreme tolerability of the drug and the profound life-altering clinical benefit it provides.
To understand why a patient would be so loyal to a medication, you really have to understand the daily physiological nightmare that is classic congenital adrenal hyperplasia.
Let's break down the biology of CAH. I know it involves the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of our kidneys.
Yes. So CAH is a rare genetic disorder that fundamentally breaks the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Normally, your brain sends a signal down to your adrenal glands to produce cortisol.
Cortisol is your primary stress hormone. It regulates your metabolism, reduces inflammation, and is literally essential for human life. If your blood pressure drops or you get an infection, you need a cortisol spike to survive.
But in a patient with CAH, there is a genetic mutation, usually an enzyme deficiency like 21-hydroxylase, that breaks the final assembly line for cortisol.
So the adrenal glands physically cannot manufacture enough cortisol. The brain senses this dangerous lack of cortisol, so it panics.
It starts screaming at the adrenal glands, pumping out massive amounts of a signaling hormone called ACTH, saying, make more cortisol, make more cortisol.
And the adrenal glands try to comply, right? They take in all the raw precursor materials, but because the cortisol assembly line is broken, all those raw materials get diverted down the only other available pathway.
And what does that pathway produce?
Androgens, male sex hormones like testosterone. So the brain's desperate attempt to get cortisol results in a massive, toxic overproduction of androgens.
I was thinking about an analogy for this mechanism. It is basically like a broken thermostat in a house in the winter.
Oh, I like this. Walk me through it.
The thermostat upstairs senses that it is freezing cold because there is no heat, no cortisol. So it blasts the basement furnace, telling it to run at maximum power.
But the ventilation duct to the upstairs is totally blocked.
Right. So all that intense heat gets diverted and trapped in the basement, overheating it to dangerous levels, which is the excess androgens, while the upstairs remains freezing.
That is a brilliant, scientifically accurate analogy. And historically, the way endocrinologists had to fix this broken thermostat was essentially through brute force.
Because the patient cannot survive without cortisol, doctors had to prescribe massive supraphysiological doses of exogenous steroids, synthetic glucocorticoids like hydrocortisone or prednisone.
They had to give them enough synthetic steroid to not only keep them alive, but to flood the brain so thoroughly that the brain finally stopped screaming at the adrenal glands to work.
It was literally the only way to shut off the excess androgen production.
So they were basically dropping a chemical anvil on the whole system. What are the long-term consequences of taking massive doses of synthetic steroids for decades? I mean, short-term prednisone makes people feel terrible, but decades of it.
The side effects of decades of high-dose steroids are systemically devastating. It causes severe, uncontrollable weight gain. It induces insulin resistance, often leading to type 2 diabetes.
It destroys bone mineral density, leading to severe osteoporosis at young ages.
And in pediatric patients, the excess androgens cause early onset puberty and rapid bone aging, meaning the growth plates fuse too early, resulting in permanently stunted adult height.
You are forcing the patient to choose between the devastating effects of the disease and the devastating effects of the cure. It is a miserable zero-sum trade-off.
But then chronicity enters the picture and completely rewires the board.
At the recent American Association of Clinical Endocrinology, the AAC meeting in Las Vegas, the chief medical officer of Neurocrine, Dr. Sanjay Kaswani, presented the comprehensive 2-year data from their Catalyst study.
And this data is the literal blueprint of how to build a modern blockbuster drug.
The headline finding was that 70% of adult patients taking Chronicity were able to bring their synthetic glucocorticoid doses all the way down into normal physiological ranges without losing control of their androgen levels.
Which is the absolute holy grail for treating this disease.
Chronicity works by directly targeting and binding to the specific receptors in the pituitary gland that release that screaming ACTH signal. It acts as a highly specific brake pedal.
By shutting off the panic signal at the source, it stops the adrenal glands from overproducing androgens.
And because the androgens are controlled by Chronicity, the doctor can safely lower the patient's steroid dose to a normal, healthy replacement level. You are essentially allowing these patients to live their lives without the massive toxic burden of heavy steroids.
And the real-world medical benefits we are seeing in the long-term data are exactly what you would expect when you remove decades of steroid toxicity.
Significantly better bone health, a halt to advanced bone aging in children, deeply decreased insulin resistance, much better weight control, and reductions in physical manifestations like severe acne and hirsutism.
It doesn't just manage the disease, it fundamentally changes the entire long-term health and mortality trajectory of the patient.
And beyond the brilliant science, Neurocrine executed a masterclass in commercial distribution. They made it incredibly easy and frictionless for patients to physically get the drug.
They use a highly specialized single pharmacy distributor called Panther.
Panther is remarkably effective at managing the labyrinth of insurance refills and prior authorizations on behalf of the patient.
Plus, the out-of-pocket financial burden for the patients is astonishingly low. On the earnings call, they noted that average out-of-pocket costs are less than $10 a month, with many patients paying absolutely nothing.
Which is a brilliant strategy. You remove the financial friction that so often derails long-term compliance for chronic treatments.
If the drug works miracles biologically, if the side effects are minimal, and if it costs you next to nothing at the pharmacy counter, of course your persistency rates are going to hover in the 80 to 90% range.
But here is where I have to play devil's advocate and push back a little bit on the commercial narrative, keeping my talk ticker's investor hat on.
Okay, let's hear it.
I caught a specific metric on the call that sounded, well, genuinely concerning to a layperson assessing the stock. Eric Benovich mentioned that despite the fast launch, most physicians who has prescribed Chronicity have only treated one single patient so far.
Just one.
Now think about that from a consumer business perspective. If you pitched me on investing in a new restaurant, and you told me that every single person who's eaten there has only gone exactly once and never returned with their friends, I would tell you that is a massive blinking red flag.
A lack of repeat business usually means the product failed.
So from a medical adoption standpoint, does that one patient metric sound like a red flag to you? Are doctors trying it and abandoning it?
If you view it through the lens of a retail consumer business, absolutely. It's a very fair analytical question. But if we connect this specific data point to the broader structural reality of how specialized endocrinology clinics actually operate, it is not a red flag at all.
Interesting. Why not?
In fact, it is exactly what you would mathematically expect. You have to understand the physical flow of patients through the medical system.
Wait, I'm thinking about how specialist medicine actually works in practice. A patient with a chronic, genetically stable endocrine issue isn't visiting their doctor every Tuesday like it's an urgent care clinic.
No, they definitely aren't.
They probably go maybe once a year for a checkup, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this simply a literal calendar bottleneck?
You hit the nail on the head. These are highly specialized clinics. Patients with stable, lifelong chronic conditions like CAH do not see their doctor frequently.
Adult patients might only see their endocrinologist for a comprehensive review once, or at most, twice a year.
Right. Pediatric patients might go 2 or 3 times a year to monitor growth plates. So, when a doctor prescribes Chronicity to their first patient who happens to come in during Q1, it is not that they don't want to prescribe it to their second or third CAH patient.
It is that their second and third CAH patients literally have not had their annual calendar appointment yet.
They aren't due in the clinic until August or November. It is the inescapable physical speed limit of clinical scheduling.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. So the denominator of total available patients simply hasn't cycled through the waiting room yet. It isn't a lack of demand or a rejection of the drug. It is just the slow turning of the calendar.
Precisely. They estimate that only about 15% of the entire CAH population is actively managed at specialized academic centers of excellence.
Where are the rest of them?
The vast majority of these patients are scattered across the country among community endocrinologists who might only have 2 or 3 CAH patients in their entire practice.
As the calendar year progresses and these scattered patients naturally cycle through for their yearly checkups, the breadth of new prescribers and the depth of repeat prescribing will organically and mathematically increase.
And there was a highly relatable, very human moment on the call regarding the early demographics of the launch, too.
Oh, right. Analysts noticed that early sales volumes skewed noticeably toward pediatric patients and adult females, with adult males lagging behind.
Eric Benovich actually joked about this, pointing out something every spouse already knows. Adult males are just notoriously terrible at going to the doctor proactively.
It is a universally well-documented phenomenon across almost every branch of medicine, unfortunately. Men avoid preventative care.
But it perfectly highlights the human element behind the data you mentioned earlier. The pediatric patients are coming into the clinic rapidly because their parents are highly motivated, actively tracking their bone age, and fighting to protect their child's long-term growth trajectory.
Adult females are generally much more proactive and organized in managing their chronic health.
The adult men are simply, well, lagging behind in their appointment scheduling. They are procrastinating.
But eventually, their prescriptions will run out, they will be forced to cycle through the clinics, and the demographic data will balance out.
Exactly. Okay, so the core commercial business is firing on absolutely all cylinders. You have Ingresa pumping out massive amounts of reliable cash, and you have Chronicity ramping up beautifully to dominate a new market.
But when a biotech company is making this much unencumbered money, 2 things happen. First, competitors immediately try to storm your castle to steal your market share. Second, you have to figure out how to spend your cash hoard to buy new growth before your patents expire.
How is Neurocrine simultaneously defending its moat and expanding its empire?
Let's start with the defensive strategy, specifically regarding the fortress they've built around Ingresa. They aren't operating in a complete vacuum. They do have a primary, highly motivated rival in the tardive dyskinesia space.
A drug called deuterated tetrabenazine, which is sold by Teva Pharmaceuticals under the brand name Austedo.
But Neurocrine didn't just rely on marketing to defend their territory. They took a highly aggressive, data-driven approach. They just presented some incredibly compelling real-world claims data at the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy meeting.
Now, real-world claims data is functionally very different from clinical trial data, right? In a trial, you are basically observing animals in a meticulously controlled zoo. Real-world data is observing what happens in the messy, chaotic jungle.
That is the perfect distinction. Clinical trials are highly controlled, artificially optimized environments. Patients are reminded to take their pills, they get free medication, they have constant nursing support.
Real-world claims data, which aggregates millions of insurance codes and pharmacy receipts, shows what is actually happening out in the chaotic day-to-day healthcare system where patients forget pills, face high copays, and deal with side effects on their own.
And this massive head-to-head real-world data set showed definitively that Ingresa has significantly higher long-term continuation rates and far fewer patients actively switching medications compared to its rival Austedo.
Which proves the drug is incredibly sticky. Once a doctor goes through the effort to prescribe Ingresa and the patient goes through the effort to get it, the biological results are so good that the patient stays on Ingresa.
And knowing they have the superior, stickier product, they are pushing aggressively to widen the very top of the diagnostic funnel. They noted that May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and specifically the first week of May is designated as TD Awareness Week,
which the internal Neurocrine teams affectionately refer to as TDOT.
They are leveraging this calendar moment to heavily mobilize their newly expanded field sales force. They are specifically pushing for routine, standardized TD screening in places that historically ignored it, like long-term care facilities and nursing homes, where the index of clinical suspicion needs to be drastically raised.
It is a brilliantly coordinated dual strategy. First, you prove to the managed care organizations and insurers that your drug is the most reliable, cost-effective long-term option by showing them the real-world retention data.
Simultaneously, you send an army of representatives to expand the top of the diagnostic funnel, forcing nursing homes and psychiatric clinics to actively screen for the movements they used to ignore. You protect the bottom of the funnel while vastly expanding the top.
But in biotech, purely playing defense is a slow death. Patents eventually expire. You have to constantly expand.
And this is where their M&A mergers and acquisition strategy comes fully into play. Neurocrine is currently in the final stages of acquiring a company called Selenotherapeutics. The deal is expected to officially close in the second quarter.
This specific acquisition is an absolute masterclass in strategic capital allocation. We mentioned Matt Abernathy's 3 corporate priorities earlier. Priority 3 was business development.
They are taking the massive free cash flow generated by Ingresa and Chronicity, and they are deploying it to buy Seleno outright, specifically to acquire one crown jewel asset, a drug called ICAT-XR.
I was reading up on the clinical target for ICAT-XR. It is designed to treat Prader-Willi syndrome. And the clinical reality of this disease is genuinely harrowing.
From what I understand, Prader-Willi is a rare, complex genetic disorder where the hypothalamus in the brain essentially malfunctions. And one of the defining, most devastating clinical features is hyperphagia.
An unrelenting, chronic, overwhelming feeling of starvation. We are not talking about a patient just having a big appetite or poor impulse control. We are talking about a broken biological mandate to eat that literally never turns off, right?
Yes. The satiety center of the brain is broken. The patient's brain is constantly chemically telling them they are starving to death, even if they just ate a massive meal.
It leads to extreme, rapid onset obesity, severe behavioral issues as the patient desperately tries to find food, and ultimately life-threatening metabolic complications.
Families often have to put literal padlocks on their refrigerators and pantry doors just to keep their children from eating themselves to death. It is a nightmare for the families.
And for decades, the pharmaceutical industry has failed to find a safe, effective chemical intervention for hyperphagia.
But Seleno cracked the code. They did the incredibly grueling, high-risk, expensive work of proving that ICAT-XR actually works to reduce hyperphagia in massive, rigorous Phase 3 clinical trials. They successfully navigated the FDA pathway.
So by acquiring Seleno now, Neurocrine is buying a completely de-risked asset.
Exactly. The scientific gamble has already been taken, and the gamble paid off. Neurocrine's CEO, Kyle Gano, specifically noted on the call that they were incredibly impressed by Selena's ability to deliver undeniably strong clinical results in such a historically complex disease.
And more importantly, their ability to secure a clean, simple label from the FDA that allows for broad commercial utilization.
Neurocrine is essentially buying a completed, successful scientific project. Now they will simply plug that drug into their massive, highly optimized commercial distribution machine to get it to every patient who needs it.
It is the perfect strategic synergy. You let the smaller biotech take the existential R&D risk, and once the data is proven, you use your massive balance sheet to buy it and scale it.
And while they are adding strategic assets, they're also doing some intelligent corporate pruning. They are divesting, which is a polite corporate word for selling off their diurnal business unit in Europe.
Kyle Gano bluntly explained that it just didn't fit their current commercial footprint or their long-term margins. They want to focus their energy, their capital, and their executive bandwidth entirely where they are strongest, the highly lucrative United States market.
So what does this all mean? If they are generating record-breaking sales, pulling in hundreds of millions in profit, acquiring billion-dollar companies, and divesting international units, are they going to suddenly get hit with a massive punitive tax bill from the government that wipes out all this generated value?
I know retail investors always panic about the tax man showing up when a company becomes highly profitable.
It is a critical, granular detail for anyone trying to build a long-term valuation model for the stock. An analyst actually specifically cornered the CFO about this exact issue during the Q&A session.
And Matt Abernethy was very clear and very reassuring. Through complex corporate structuring and R&D tax credits, their non-JAP effective tax rate is safely locked in at a very manageable 22 to 24% for this current year.
More importantly, he expects it to stay stable in the low 20s for the foreseeable future,
which provides incredible stability. That tax predictability is exactly why they can afford to take massive, high-risk swings in the laboratory.
Because when you look at where all this protected capital is flowing, it takes us straight into the future. Let's explore the 2027 horizon.
This is the most exciting part of the call, because this is where we look beyond the current commercial success of 2026 and peek behind the curtain of the laboratory.
Because ultimately, the true multi-billion-dollar valuation of a biotech company does not lie in the drugs it sells today. It lies entirely in the promise of its pipeline, the groundbreaking drugs it will sell tomorrow.
And Neurocrine is explicitly structuring and planning for 2027 to be an absolute monumental blockbuster year of clinical data readouts.
They are not resting on their laurels, slowly counting the Ingresa money. They are taking huge, audacious scientific swings in some of the most complex, difficult, and historically high failure rate medical fields on the planet.
Let's start with psychiatry. They currently have 3 massive phase 3 trials aggressively enrolling patients as we speak.
And just to underscore the gravity of that, phase 3 is the final, largest, and by far the most phenomenally expensive hurdle a drug must clear before a company can ask the FDA for commercial approval.
Running one phase 3 trial is a massive corporate undertaking. If a company has 3 phase 3 psychiatric trials running simultaneously, they're placing incredibly massive, confident bets on their underlying neurochemistry.
The first major bet is a drug called osavampator, which is targeting major depressive disorder, or MDD. But what is fascinating is their clinical strategy. They aren't just trying to make another generic frontline antidepressant to compete with Zoloft or Prozac.
Dr. Kuswani, the chief medical officer, explained that they are specifically designing and positioning osavampator as an add-on therapy for patients who are actively failing their standard antidepressant regimens,
which represents a staggeringly huge unmet medical need. The tragic reality of depression treatment is that millions of patients try standard SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SNRIs, and they just do not get adequate relief.
Their depression remains treatment resistant. Historically, doctors would just make them cross-taper and switch to yet another standard drug, forcing them to endure weeks of withdrawal and side effects, hoping the new one works better.
But osavampator changes the paradigm. Instead of stopping their current drug, it is designed to be taken alongside it, leveraging a different neural pathway to push the brain into a superior synergistic response.
By doing that, Neurocrine brilliantly carves out a specific, highly valuable, uncontested niche in an otherwise incredibly crowded and genericized market.
It is brilliant clinical positioning. And their second major psychiatric bet is even more chemically complex. They have a drug called doricladine, which is currently targeting schizophrenia and severe bipolar mania.
Direclidine is a highly selective M4 muscarinic receptor agonist. Now, the deep neuroscience here is incredibly complex, but the core concept is revolutionary.
Let's break down that core concept. Earlier, we talked about how traditional schizophrenia drugs work by bluntly blocking dopamine D2 receptors, which eventually causes the devastating movement disorders like tardive dyskinesia. How does an M4 muscarinic agonist work differently?
Instead of bluntly attacking the dopamine receptor itself, the M4 muscarinic receptors act as an upstream, highly nuanced regulatory network. Think of it like traffic control.
Okay, traffic control.
By agonizing or activating the M4 receptor, direclidine essentially sends a gentle, modulating signal that naturally turns down the volume of dopamine release in the specific areas of the brain causing the hallucinations without completely paralyzing the dopamine system everywhere else.
They're finding a new, non-traditional, highly targeted backdoor pathway to treat severe mental illness.
And by using that backdoor, they completely avoid the heavy, debilitating movement side effects of traditional antipsychotics. If they succeed in phase 3, it wouldn't just be a new drug, it would fundamentally revolutionize the global standard of psychiatric care.
But they aren't stopping at the brain. Let's look at the metabolic space, because Neurocrine is officially jumping headfirst into the global obesity wars.
The obesity wars. It is the single most lucrative pharmaceutical arms race in human history.
Right now, drugs like Ozempic, Wegovy, and Mounjaro, the GLP-1 and GIP agonists, are completely dominating the cultural conversation in the stock market. They are generating tens of billions of dollars.
But from a clinical perspective, they are far from perfect.
They really aren't. On the earnings call, an analyst specifically brought up the massive clinical data sets coming out of Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk.
The analyst noted that while the sheer volume of weight loss from GLP-1s is undeniably impressive, the side effect profile, the constant nausea, the severe vomiting, the debilitating diarrhea, and the loss of lean muscle mass are massive, sometimes intolerable hurdles for millions of patients.
Many people simply stop taking the drug because they cannot function while feeling constantly sick.
Exactly. The current generation of weight loss drugs essentially works by massively slowing down gastric emptying and hammering the brain's nausea center so the patient feels too full and too mildly ill to want to eat.
And this is exactly where Neurocrine thinks they have engineered a vastly superior mousetrap.
Yeah.
You have developed a novel molecule called NBIP-2118, which is a CRF2 peptide agonist.
And their grand strategy is to combine it with another proprietary drug, NBIP-1968, which is a GGG agonist.
This is where I have to pause and push back on the strategy, because combining novel mechanisms sounds incredibly risky. If you were running a phase 2 trial combining a novel CRF2 agonist with a novel GGG agonist, aren't you exponentially increasing your risk of a massive safety signal?
It's a valid concern.
If a patient develops a severe liver toxicity or a cardiac issue, how do they even know which of the two experimental drugs caused the problem? Isn't it safer to test one at a time?
From a purely cautious, conservative trial design perspective, yes, testing one at a time is safer. But in the multi-billion-dollar obesity race, being cautious means being irrelevant.
Fair point.
Neurocrine is making a calculated, highly aggressive scientific bet. They believe that by combining these two entirely different mechanisms of action, they can unlock a vastly superior therapeutic window.
How so? What do CRF2 and GGG actually do differently than a GLP-1?
The GGG pathway is highly targeted at pure fat oxidation and increasing basal metabolic rate, while the CRF2 pathway, the corticotropin-releasing factor type 2 receptor, is deeply involved in stress response, appetite regulation, and crucially, preserving skeletal muscle mass during weight loss.
Instead of just hammering the gut and the nausea center with a GLP-1, Neurocrine is attempting a metabolic symphony.
By hitting CRF2 and GGG simultaneously, they are trying to fundamentally rewire the body to burn fat, preserve muscle, and reduce appetite organically without triggering the severe gastrointestinal distress that plagues Ozempic.
So a superior therapeutic window means you get the dramatic, life-changing weight loss of a GLP-1, but you preserve your muscle mass and you don't spend 3 days a week feeling like you have food poisoning.
If they can pull that off in the clinical data, they hold a multi-billion-dollar golden ticket.
It is the definition of high risk, high reward. They expect to release the top-line data from the CRF2 program in 2027, and Wall Street will be watching that data release like a hawk.
But their ambition isn't limited to mass-market blockbusters. They're pushing deeply into the heartbreaking world of rare genetic diseases, too. They highlighted a gene therapy program, NBI-B223, which is targeting Friedreich's ataxia.
Friedreich's ataxia is a profoundly devastating disease. It is a progressive, currently incurable nervous system disorder. It usually strikes children or teenagers, and it causes progressive damage to the spinal cord and peripheral nerves.
It leads to severe muscle weakness, loss of coordination, and eventually life-shortening cardiac complications. Patients usually end up permanently in a wheelchair.
It is caused by a genetic mutation that prevents the body from producing enough of a crucial mitochondrial protein called frataxin. Without frataxin, the cells, especially the highly energy-dependent nerve and heart cells, essentially suffocate and die.
NBI-B223 is an AAV-based gene therapy. They are essentially using a harmless virus as a microscopic delivery truck. They load the correct functioning copy of the frataxin gene into the viral shell and inject it into the patient.
The virus enters the patient's cells and delivers the correct genetic code, permanently teaching the cells how to produce their own frataxin.
Which is why on the call, the CEO explicitly and intentionally used the word curative. They are entering phase 1B clinical trials later this year, and they aren't just looking to manage the symptoms, they're looking to provide a one-time curative genetic therapy.
The idea that a single infusion could halt the progression of a disease like that gives me absolute chills.
It is the absolute pinnacle of modern biotechnology. And while they are reaching for cures in neurology, they haven't forgotten their rapidly growing endocrine franchise either. They are already actively developing next-gen CAH treatments to follow up on chronicity.
They highlighted a molecule called NBI-1435, which is a novel injectable peptide.
Wait, if chronicity is an oral pill that is already achieving 80% persistency, why spend millions developing an injectable version? Do patients actually want shots instead of pills?
It is about building an impenetrable, comprehensive franchise. They view the oral chronicity pill as the foundational, absolute first-line therapy for the foreseeable future. But 1435 is being strategically developed as a powerful second-line option.
Because it is a highly engineered injectable peptide, its half-life in the body is vastly longer. It could potentially offer a drastically less frequent dosing schedule, perhaps requiring only one injection a week, or even just one injection a month instead of remembering to take daily pills.
For non-compliant patients, or patients with severe gastrointestinal absorption issues, a once-a-month injection is a game changer. They're building an entire portfolio of mechanisms around this one disease state to ensure they can capture and help absolutely every type of patient profile.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting there. Because when you are testing all these different highly complex molecules across all these different bodily systems, sometimes you discover things you weren't even looking for. Science is full of accidental miracles.
During the Q&A portion of the call, an analyst asked a seemingly routine question about the broader potential of the CRF receptor, the same hormonal pathway they're targeting for their obesity drug. And Dr. Khoswani dropped a casual tidbit that was absolutely fascinating.
If you were paying close attention to the neurobiology, this was an absolute stop the presses moment buried deep in a financial update.
He casually mentioned that they are noticing compelling anecdotal clinical evidence that their CAH patients who are currently taking medications designed to modulate these exact hormone axes are experiencing distinct, measurable improvements in their executive functioning.
Let's translate the profound implications of that term. Executive functioning is essentially your brain's CEO. It is the complex cognitive management system located in the prefrontal cortex. It controls your working memory, your flexible thinking, your impulse control, your ability to plan, and your capacity to focus. It is higher order cognition.
Exactly. Dr. Khoswani suggested there may be a direct, hidden biological link between the peripheral CRF hormone pathway and central cognitive processing. They are literally observing that as they pharmacologically tune the body's peripheral hormones just to fix the adrenal glands, the patient's brains are mysteriously working better. Their working memory improves. Their focus sharpens.
Which implies that the CRF pathway might be a universal biological dial for cognitive clarity. But this incredible breadth of discovery raises an important question. We are looking at an R&D pipeline that now aggressively spans major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, GLP-1 competing obesity therapies, gene therapy for ataxia, and next-gen endocrine treatments. Can a mid-sized company that historically focused almost entirely on movement disorders like tardive dyskinesia successfully fund and fight multi-billion-dollar clinical battles across all of these vastly different, highly specialized therapeutic areas all at exactly the same time? Is it a brilliant diversification or a catastrophic lack of focus?
It is an incredibly ambitious, borderline dangerous stretch of resources. But as CEO Kyle Gano wisely noted, Neurocrine's entire corporate history was built on the foundation of strategic partnerships. They have a long, highly successful history of in-licensing early-stage molecules from smaller labs and out-licensing their massive discoveries to larger conglomerates.
If they happen to hit the absolute golden ticket in obesity or cognitive enhancement, but they realize the global commercialization effort is too massive for their San Diego sales force to handle alone, they are perfectly positioned. They can simply partner with a mega pharma titan like Pfizer or Novartis to fund the final stages and bring it across the global finish line while keeping a massive royalty stream for themselves.
Exactly. They have the massive, reliable, predictable cash flow from Ingresa and Chronicity to fund the risky early-stage exploration. And they have the pragmatic strategic flexibility to monetize those discoveries however makes the most financial and clinical sense. They aren't letting ego get in the way of commercialization.
So bringing this entire vast, complex ecosystem together, what is the ultimate takeaway from this 2026 earnings call? Neurocrine Biosciences is serving as a textbook masterclass example of how to use highly successful, incredibly sticky foundational drugs to fund a wildly ambitious, high-risk future. They aren't resting on their laurels. They aren't just stockpiling cash or buying back stock to artificially inflate their share price. They are actively, aggressively building the medicines of the 2030s using the cash generated today.
It really highlights the profound, inescapable interconnectedness of corporate finance and human medicine. For you listening, it is incredibly worth reflecting on how these sterile, behind-the-scenes Wall Street earnings calls actually dictate the literal timeline of when life-saving medicines reach the public.
If a phase 2 trial for a rare disease is delayed simply because a company missed its quarterly revenue targets by 2% and had to ruthlessly cut its R&D budget to appease angry shareholders, that isn't just a spreadsheet error. That means a desperate patient in a wheelchair waits another entire year for a cure.
It is a breathtakingly high-stakes ecosystem. Finance is the lifeblood of the laboratory. And this entire deep dive leaves me with one final, deeply philosophical thought for you to mull over as we wrap up.
Go for it. Lay it on us.
We have spent the last hour talking about fundamentally tuning the human body. Neurocrine is pharmacologically tuning complex hormone axis. They are lowering toxic sledgehammer steroids while flawlessly maintaining targeted androgen control with Chronicity. They are precisely tweaking incredibly delicate neural pathways to completely stop violent, involuntary movements with Ingresa without blocking the psychiatric benefits. They are aggressively exploring novel combinations of peptides that might fundamentally alter the CRF and GGG pathways to safely cure obesity, and in the process, they're accidentally discovering that they might be improving human working memory and cognition.
It is an era of profound, unprecedented molecular precision. We are moving away from brute force medicine.
So here's the question. Are we rapidly crossing an invisible threshold? Are we moving toward a future where the human body is treated less like a mysterious, unpredictable, fragile biological organism that we just have to endure, and more like a piece of complex, highly programmable software? A biological machine that, when it inevitably glitches or encounters a genetic error code, we don't just crudely treat the external symptoms, we simply identify the broken pathway and debug it with the exact right, highly customized peptide injection.
That is the ultimate transhumanist promise of modern biotechnology. We are moving past the era of managing illness and entering the era of rewriting the underlying biological code back to a state of absolute health.
It is incredible and slightly terrifying to think about the power of that precision. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the science and strategy of Neurocrine. Keep questioning the physical world around you. Keep looking for the profound human stories hidden inside the dense corporate spreadsheets, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.